There are many myths about Jesus. In these programs, we're exploring the facts behind the myths. Imagine you're writing a story about people who lived in another country 100 years ago. Could you give them the right names? Could you get it right which names were popular and which were unusual? Chances are that you couldn't. To make it harder, you aren't allowed to do any online research. How much did the people who wrote the Bible's accounts of Jesus know about the people they wrote about? If they were hundreds of miles away in another country, they wouldn't have had the information they needed to get the names right. So where were the accounts of Jesus written?
Well, one of the things that seems to be widely agreed is that most of the four Gospels were written outside the land they report about. So the traditional understanding is that only Matthew was written in the land of Israel or Palestine. And more recent scholarship, some of the skeptical scholarship has tended to say 3 or maybe 4 of those Gospels are written outside the land. It's then very striking to look at the Gospels and see the detailed knowledge that they seem to presuppose of the land itself. They know the geography of the land, they know where it goes up and down, they know travelling times, they know that one of the main industries in the area of Capernaum is fishing. They know the names of plants in particular areas. Luke's Gospel has a sycamore tree in Jericho, where of course there were sycamore trees. That's what Zacchaeus is said to climb up. Then they've got the right names for individuals. They have the right relative frequency of different names that we can test and compare with bone boxes and historians like Josephus and writings like the Dead Sea Scrolls and say, yes, the most common name in the New Testament for a Jewish male is Simon. That's also the most common outside the New Testament. And also, it's the same with the most common female name. The most common female name is Mary. Inside the New Testament, it's also the most common outside the New Testament. You get names occurring more or less in the right relative proportion. And this is a pattern occurring across 4 different books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's hard to see how anyone could collude to get that right. Jews in different countries had different names. So merely someone writing in a different country, making up a story about Jewish characters wouldn't get those names in the right proportion. So those sorts of things, I think, are features which suggest that if these writings really did come from outside the land, they must have had some reliable sources, reliable traditions to hand the information on to them.
Could these accounts have been fiction or forgeries?
It'd be difficult for a forger to get the sort of name patterns we have in the Gospels, because a forger would not have access to statistical information about the relative frequency of names. Someone who had, of course, lived in a land might know what names people tended to have in those lands, but they would know that intuitively. And our intuitions about the relative frequency of names are not very reliable. So you wouldn't get the same pattern occurring if it was simply down to someone's intuitions. And of course you'd have to have that same process applied to each of the different Gospels. If someone is making up names and getting them right, that wouldn't really work, because we find that names that only Luke has or only John has fit into the general pattern. So it would be difficult to imagine how just someone making up characters and giving them a plausible sounding name for the time and place would get the pattern that we actually have.
What does the evidence of the names in the Bible's accounts prove?
Well, I think that what the argument about names establishes, at the very least, is that the Gospel writers have access to high quality information from the land. I think it's hard to say that they simply made up the names and got those patterns right. I'd also say that because we know that names can be very hard to remember, we forget people's names all the time, that would mean that getting those sort of names right consistently across extended books like Matthew, Mark, Luke and John suggests that they are not many steps removed from the actual events that they narrate.
The Bible writers used the right names for people, and they got it right which names were popular and which were unusual. This shows that their accounts were based on reliable information from people who actually lived in the land. Next time, we'll look at more evidence that the Bible's accounts of Jesus are based on the testimony of people who saw and heard him, of eyewitnesses.